Hey dude, let's not romanticize it. Food in medieval times sucked. It was bland, boiled, and half the time it made you sick. Bread was hard, meat was rare, and spices. Only if you were rich. Most days, you were lucky to get anything warm that didn't taste like dirt or rot. Tonight, we're digging into what people actually ate back then and why every meal felt like a gamble. Forget feasts and goblets. This is porridge, moldy cheese, and meat that may or may not kill you. If weird, honest history helps calm your brain, hit like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it for you? Now dim the lights, get cozy, and let's fall asleep to a time when dinner was kind of a nightmare. You wake to the distant creak of wooden wheels and the scratch of a quill against parchment, sounds that, to a medieval ear, signaled duty and taxation. But the true ruler of your life isn't a king or knight. It's wheat. Not bread, not grain, but wheat, the pale, stubborn crop that covered Europe like a scratchy woolen blanket, dictating everything from your diet to your death. Wheat in the Middle Ages was far from the fluffy loaf you might picture today. It was gritty, coarse, and often mixed with other cereals just to make it last. What made wheat powerful wasn't its taste, but the systems it bound together: farming, taxation, religion, and hunger. It was less food and more infrastructure, a dull but absolute monarch. Let's begin in Carolingian France, around the 9th century. By now, the Roman Empire had been replaced with patchwork kingdoms, and society had fractured into lords, peasants, and clergy. Central to this structure was land, and central to land was wheat. It was not only the staple food but the standard by which value was measured. If you were a peasant, your life revolved around your lord's wheat field. You didn't own the land. You didn't choose what to plant. You didn't even get to eat most of what you harvested. Instead, you were allowed to cultivate a strip of the manorial field in exchange for handing over a portion of your wheat, often up to 50%, as rent or tax. The rest, often lost to rodents, rot, or the simple inability to thresh it fast enough before the weather turned. The land was usually divided into 3 field rotations, one for autumn wheat, one for spring barley or legumes, and one left fallow. This cycle ensured that the soil could recover somewhat, but it also meant that even in ideal years, you only had 2 harvests per 3 plots. And wheat, sensitive and demanding, was the diva of medieval agriculture. It required good soil, moderate rainfall, and careful weeding. Fail at any of these and your crop would fail. But here's the twist: even if it failed, you still owed wheat. Rent didn't pause for weather. Lords didn't forgive debts. If you couldn't pay, you might forfeit your oxen, your tools, or your freedom. In fact, the grain tithe, a religious obligation where a tenth of your wheat went to the church, made the church one of the biggest landowners and wheat collectors in Europe. Cathedrals weren't built on piety alone. They were fed by bushels of grain wheeled in by tired farmers. Storage was another bleak chapter. Medieval granaries were primitive and wheat spoiled easily. Mice were constant, as were insects. To try and stave off rot, farmers sometimes dried their grain in communal ovens. But even then, grain stored too long could develop mold. And not just any mold, claviceps purpurea or ergot, which caused seizures, hallucinations, and death. Yet in many areas, wheat was still preferred to other cereals. Why? Because wheat was the bread grain. In cities and monasteries, white bread from wheat was considered a mark of status. It had to be sifted and milled multiple times, often by skilled bakers using communal ovens, bakers who, by law, had to sell at fixed prices. These bakers were sometimes punished with fines or public shamming if their loaves were too small or their prices too high. Meanwhile, rural peasants made their own loaves using a mix of wheat, rye, barley, and even acorns. These maslin breads were hard, dense, and sometimes greenish with age, but they filled the stomach, barely. Monasteries, ever the record keepers, cataloged wheat yields carefully. In years of plenty, Wheat could feed the monks, the poor, and the marketplace. In lean years, the chroniclers would mark down the suffering with dispassionate precision. In the year of our Lord 1109, the wheat harvest failed. Many died in the fields. The poor ate roots. Yet even in death, wheat ruled. Funeral bread, a long-forgotten tradition, was baked and given to mourners. In some areas, families had to provide a loaf to the priest in exchange for burial rites. Wheat determined not only your life and your work, but your afterlife. Let's not forget the human cost of this system. The manorial economy which revolved around wheat was inherently exploitative. Lords extracted not only crops but labor. You might spend days reaping his wheat before touching your own. And then, if rains came early or frost struck your strip of wheat, your entire year's food might be lost. And there were no grocery stores, no relief trucks. In such times, hunger spread not quickly but slowly. First the old bread was eaten, then the grain stores, then the seed grain, supposed to be held back for planting next season. Eating it meant gambling your entire future for another week of survival. Still, wheat persisted, because for all its flaws it was calorically dense, somewhat storable, and, most importantly, deeply embedded in the culture. To change it would mean to change everything. But wheat's dominance had another cost: vulnerability. Whole communities hinged on a single crop, year after year, with little diversification. The term feast or famine wasn't just a saying, it was the shape of the calendar. Wheat monoculture meant that any disease, bad weather, or war could turn abundance into starvation. And then came the weather. In the early 14th century, Europe entered what we now call the Little Ice Age. The summers shortened, the rains lengthened, and for wheat this was catastrophic. Yields plummeted, storage failed, and in 1315 a catastrophic famine began, one not caused by war but by the silent, stubborn failure of a crop that had ruled for too long. But that's another section. The wheat fields of Europe were always a gamble, but by the early 14th century the stakes rose sharply, and suddenly. What followed wasn't a tragedy of unexpected weather. It was a famine built into the system itself. Welcome to 1315, a year now synonymous with widespread hunger across northern Europe. It wasn't a single event but a cascade. Cold springs, unending rain, and soils that turned to mud instead of yield. This was the beginning of the Great Famine, and though it lasted just a few years, 1315 to 1317, its consequences stretched through generations. This wasn't a famine of absence. There was still some wheat, some barley, some oats, but the system built around these crops was so rigid, so dependent on precise harvest cycles, that when the rhythm broke, everything collapsed. First came the weather. For medieval farmers, knowledge of climate wasn't scientific. It was observational, ritualistic. When it rained for weeks instead of days and planting was delayed past the St. Mark's Day feast, they knew something was wrong. But what could they do? Wheat had to be sown at a specific time. If the rains drowned the seeds, there was no do-over. And this rain wasn't kind. Chroniclers across France, England, and the Low Countries describe entire fields submerged. In Flanders, towns reported wheat sprouting fungus in the heads before harvest. In Yorkshire, barley rotted in place. What little was salvaged couldn't be dried properly. In an era before artificial storage, farmers depended on air circulation, sun, and smoke to keep mold away. That year, the granaries never dried out. Prices soared. In some areas, grain tripled in cost, but this didn't mean the rich grew thin. It meant the poor died sooner. Urban workers, already spending up to 80% of their wages on food, could no longer afford bread. Rural peasants, dependent on their own plots and reserves, began to sell tools, livestock, even future labor rights in exchange for a sack of meal. This leads us to a cruel irony. Grain was available, just priced out of reach. Lords hoarded. Merchants speculated. In London, the grain markets turned to price fixing and fraud. In France, Ships carrying imported wheat were hijacked by desperate mobs. The famine didn't just hit individuals. It destroyed trust. Families turned on one another. Fathers abandoned children. In monasteries, monks recorded confessions of cannibalism, hard to verify but deeply feared. In some cities, criminal executions were postponed because authorities feared the condemned might be rescued and eaten before the rope did its work. But why was the system so fragile? Because the medieval grain economy was centralized, hierarchical, and non-resilient. Instead of local surplus sharing, most food was routed upward, tithes to the church, taxes to the lords, obligations to the manor. In normal years, this created a surplus at the top and just enough at the bottom. In famine years, it became a death funnel. Let's break this down. A typical medieval village had fields allocated not for efficiency, but tradition. Strip farming, while useful for shared plowing, meant that if one strip failed, so likely did the rest. There were no backup plots, no greenhouse grains, no rotation into hardier crops during crisis. Storage laws were no better. In England, the assize of bread and ale tried to fix prices but not protect stocks. Millers and bakers were required to operate, but in bad harvests, many simply shut down, claiming they had no grain to mill. Others mixed ground beans, sawdust, or chalk into flour, causing further illness. In cities like Bruges or Ghent, grain was shipped in from abroad, but storms and piracy made that supply unpredictable. And there were no central relief agencies, no medieval Red Cross. The church, while rich in resources, often interpreted famine as divine punishment. Relief came in prayers, not grain sacks. And let's not forget the animals. Livestock suffered greatly during the famine, not just from hunger, but from being sold or slaughtered prematurely. Draft animals, particularly oxen, were eaten in desperation. But these animals were the tractors of their time. Without them, the next planting season became impossible. So every cow consumed today guaranteed a thinner tomorrow. Some regions tried desperate adaptation. Rye and oats, more resilient grains, were planted in place of wheat. But these changes came too late and required knowledge that most villagers simply didn't have, or weren't allowed to implement under feudal contracts. Remember, the Lord decided what crops were grown. Peasants followed orders, not innovation. What about the nobility during this time? Were they immune? Not entirely. While lords and abbots rarely starved, their wealth was affected. With laborers dead or too weak to farm, fields lay fallow. With wheat prices erratic, tithes shrank. Some nobles even wrote of eating coarse bread and giving up wine, an indignity, not a tragedy. But a more curious consequence emerged, a labor shortage. As millions perished or fled, landowners began to face a silent panic. Who would sow next season's crop? Who would harvest the wheat? Who would pay rent? In England, for example, lords began to offer better terms to surviving workers. This marked a slow beginning of the end for rigid serfdom, though it would take another catastrophe, the Black Death, to push it further. But for now, in 1316, the reigns continued. One anonymous monk in a French priory noted, "We buried them with no rights. No one could pay the tithe for death. The granary was opened, and yet the stomach remained empty. We prayed, and yet the sky did not hear." By 1317, conditions began to ease. The rains lifted. The wheat crop, modest and delayed, returned. But the scars of those years remained. In graveyards, in charters renegotiated, in barns half empty. Across Europe, birth rates dropped. Records of marriage and baptisms fell sharply for several years, a sign of social and emotional collapse. And the fear, it lingered. People remembered. They remembered that wheat, the very thing they trusted to sustain them, had failed. Or rather, the system they had built around wheat had failed. So did things change? A little slowly. More attention was paid to grain diversity. In Germany and Scandinavia, rye gained popularity. In mountainous regions, barley was seen as a hedge. Even peas and beans, once considered food for the poor, began to gain respect. But these were regional, inconsistent responses. The truth is, Europe went back to wheat, because tradition is stronger than hunger. And while the famine of 1317 was over, a more violent, more transformative crisis loomed on the horizon. A black cloud that would make the fields irrelevant. But that is the story for the next section. By the time the wheat harvest of 1346 was gathered, the scars of the Great Famine still lingered in memory. Fields were sown again, but never without worry. Every gray cloud brought anxiety. Every lean loaf of bread reminded the people of what had happened 30 years prior. But even this lingering fear could not prepare them for what came next. The Black Death swept through Europe like nothing before or since. While many know it as a story of urban death, it was also a story of rural collapse, of wheat fields left untended, mills abandoned, ovens gone cold. Wheat had ruled for centuries, but now death ruled instead. When the plague arrived, it moved faster than any grain shortage. By 1347, it had reached Sicily. By 1348, it had swept through France and England. In some villages, half the population died in weeks. Entire farming communities vanished. Plowmen, thatchers, bakers, millers, all gone. And what happens when no one is left to harvest the wheat? It rots. In some places, rats feasted on abandoned grain as people barricaded themselves indoors. In others, church bells tolled endlessly, a grim soundtrack to wheat fields turned to graveyards. And still, the cycle of obligation remained. Tithes still demanded, rent still expected. But with so few left, who was there to collect them? The economy cracked open. Labor became scarce. In England, this led to the Statute of Labourers in 1351, an attempt to freeze wages and keep peasants from demanding more. But it didn't work. With fewer hands to till the land, those who survived gained leverage. The very wheat that had once enslaved them became their bargaining chip. Peasants began to negotiate, or in some cases, to abandon the manorial system altogether. They moved to towns. They rented land. They demanded money for labor instead of servile obligations. The rigid feudal pyramid softened, not overnight but over decades. Wheat fields were no longer just food factories. They became sites of economic revolution. But this wasn't progress as we imagine it. It was slow, patchy, often reversed. Lords fought back. Rebellions were crushed. And still, wheat held its grip. Its symbolism, its centrality in the European diet, its sacred place in religious ritual, all of it remained. After all, Eucharistic bread, the centerpiece of Christian Mass, was made from wheat. Not barley, not rye, wheat. It had a divine role, a spiritual monopoly. In this sense, wheat was immortal even when people were not. One curious result of the plague years was the improvement in diet, at least temporarily. With fewer mouths to feed and abandoned land to farm, survivors often had better access to meat, legumes, and fresh bread. For a time, the peasant's plate looked less like a famine victim's and more like a minor lord's. But this didn't last. By the late 14th century, population growth resumed. Wheat prices fluctuated again. And as towns grew, the demand for white bread increased. Urban bakers, once marginal figures, became central to public life, so much so that bread riots became common. In Paris, in London, in Florence, the quality and weight of bread were matters of public order. Cities introduced grain reserves. Some even built public granaries, early forms of food security. In Venice, the Magazzino del Grano was stocked with emergency supplies. But these were exceptions, not the rule. The vast majority of Europe still lived one harvest away from hunger. Wheat continued to dictate taxation and trade, too. In regions like Champagne, wheat tolls funded road maintenance. In the Hanseatic League, wheat shipments determined the seasonal rhythm of Baltic commerce. In southern Italy, whole villages were taxed in grain. Even in warfare, wheat was a target. Armies would burn fields, not just to deprive the enemy of food, but to unravel their economy. Wheat wasn't just edible, it was political. Yet not all wheat was equal. A curious divide emerged between hard wheat, used for pasta in the Mediterranean, and soft wheat, preferred in the north for bread. Climate dictated cultivation, but economics shaped identity. In Italy, wheat became a source of cultural pride, with durum wheat rising in value. In the north, softer wheats were prized for producing the pale, fluffy loaves preferred by nobility. The link between class and grain never disappeared. Throughout the 15th century, agricultural manuals began to appear, some written by monks, others by landowners. These detailed the best methods for planting, rotating, harvesting, and thrashing wheat. It marked the beginning of a more scientific approach to farming, though still rudimentary by today's standards. Still, this shift revealed something important. Wheat was no longer untouchable. It could be studied, improved, challenged. And in the century that followed, it would be. The introduction of the New World crops like maize and potatoes would eventually loosen wheat's grip, but not yet. For now, Europe remained a continent of bread. Not just any bread, but wheat bread, holy bread, taxed bread, bread that had seen empires rise, peasants starve, and cities riot. Bread that had survived famine, plague, and feudalism. And so we arrive at a strange conclusion. Wheat in the Middle Ages was not merely food. It was a system, a fragile, inflexible, hunger-prone system that shaped everything from your daily labor to your final prayer. A boring grain, perhaps, but a powerful one. And though the world has changed, wheat still lingers in our diet, our rituals, our language. When we speak of earning your bread, we echo fields long buried. When we say someone is the breadwinner, we unconsciously invoke the manorial fields, the tax sheaves, the stone mills. And when we break bread together, even casually, we echo an act once governed by law, labor, and fear. Wheat ruled the Middle Ages, not with a crown, but with a crust. Close your eyes and picture dinner, not a feast or banquet, but the daily meal of a medieval peasant. You're sitting on a wooden bench. The table is rough-hewn. There is no silverware, only a spoon you made yourself, and perhaps a shared knife for the household. Before you, steaming gently in a cracked clay bowl, is a grayish-brown stew. It is not delicious, it is not fresh, but it is warm, and it is all you have. Welcome to the diet of a medieval peasant. Forget roast meats, sweet pies, and goblets of wine. That was food for lords and saints. For the vast majority of medieval Europeans, those who worked the land, who served in silence, who died without tombstones, daily food was a mixture of what they could grow, what they could forage, and what they were permitted to keep. Beans, barley, cabbage, leeks, peas, turnips, onions. These were not variety, they were monotony. Yet this repetitive diet sustained millions for centuries. The cornerstone of the peasant diet was a dense, dark, often sour rye or barley bread. Wheat was too expensive and mostly reserved for nobility, monasteries, or urban markets. Rye, while hardy and resistant to poor soil, was vulnerable to a fungus called ergot, the same that caused hallucinations and in bad years death. Still, it was eaten daily. And to soften the crusts, peasants often soaked bread in pottage, a slow-boiled stew made from whatever was available. Beans, peas, onions, cabbage, sometimes a bit of barley or oats, occasionally a scrap of pork fat or bone, but meat was rare. Often, families went weeks without tasting it. This pottage could be reheated for days. It was a living dish, constantly changing as more water or ingredients were added. It absorbed the week's meals and misfortunes alike. Vegetables were central but not necessarily valued. In fact, many vegetables we now treasure, like carrots or kale, were seen as inferior. They were not luxuries but survival foods. Leeks and onions were common because they stored well. Turnips, bland and fibrous, were cheap and abundant. Cabbage, boiled beyond recognition, featured heavily in winter meals. Salt was expensive and often hoarded by the lord. Peasants rarely had enough for preservation. Instead, they relied on drying, fermenting, or simply eating food before it spoiled. Milk, when available, was drunk raw or turned into curds or sour cheese. Butter was rare and sometimes sold at market rather than eaten. Eggs were a treat. Chickens were too valuable alive to eat regularly. Even more than livestock, fuel was precious. Cooking took wood or dried dung, resources not always easy to spare. A fire had to be kept alive and ovens were often communal. Peasants cooked over open hearths, sometimes sharing a pot with multiple families. Privacy was a luxury. Hunger was the constant companion. Drinking water was often suspect. If a stream was downstream of a village or mill, it might carry disease. So peasants drank small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew made from grains. It didn't taste good. It wasn't strong, but it was safer than water. And yet, despite this grim diet, survival required ingenuity. Peasants foraged. The hedgerows and woodlands became silent pantries. In spring, they gathered nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic. In summer, berries, mushrooms, and hazelnuts. In fall, apples and sloes. Every season offered something if you knew where to look, and if you weren't punished for trespassing on your lord's land. You see, the forest was not free. In many places, hunting or even collecting firewood required permission. A snared rabbit could feed a family for 2 days, but if caught, it could also get your hand cut off. The diet varied slightly by region. In coastal areas, fish and shellfish were more common. In Mediterranean zones, olive oil, garlic, and lentils appeared more often. But inland, the diet was relentless in its dullness. Breakfast was rare, usually just a crust of bread, if anything. The main meal came in the early afternoon after hours in the field. Supper was light if it happened at all. There were no snacks, no sugar, no coffee, no chocolate, not even potatoes. Those wouldn't arrive in Europe until centuries later. Hunger was a normal part of life. In fact, hunger was built into the calendar. The medieval year was shaped by 2 things, the church and the harvest. Between the two, over half the year was designated as fasting days. Lent, Advent, Ember Days, Saints' Vigils. On these days, meat was forbidden, as were dairy and eggs. The wealthy circumvented this with fish and exotic substitutes. The poor simply ate less. Fasting wasn't optional, it was enforced. In monasteries, even children were expected to comply, and breaking a fast could mean fines or worse. But starvation, that wasn't punished, it was ignored. So how did people cope? Community mattered. Villages were tight-knit if not always harmonious. Food might be shared during hardship. Church alms sometimes provided thin gruel or bread. Monasteries offered charity loaves, and on feast days, lords might sponsor a public meal, often more for display than generosity. Still, death by hunger was common. In poor harvest years, villages saw spikes in mortality, especially among children and the elderly. Bodies were buried quickly. The cause of death was often listed as the hunger, or simply not listed at all. Even those who lived bore the scars. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons reveal short stature, bowed legs, tooth decay, and malnutrition markers. Many peasants had their first adult molars worn flat from eating coarse bread filled with grit from poorly cleaned flour. Dental abscesses were common, and there were no dentists. Illness was constant. Malnourishment weakened the immune system. Cuts turned to infections. Diarrhea was deadly. One minor illness could tip someone from subsistence to starvation. And yet people endured. They endured the hunger, the sameness, the bitterness of old turnips and the sourness of spoiled ale. They endured because they had no choice. Because food was not about taste, it was about not dying. But the most sobering thought is this: many of these people did not even know their diet was poor. This was the world. This was food. The idea that eating should bring joy or variety was foreign. Eating brought fuel, strength, and a short pause before the next day's labor. Still, even among all this grayness, there were moments of warmth. A shared bowl by the fire, a rare chicken slaughtered for a wedding, a handful of blackberries given to a child. Small pleasures, fleeting tastes. They were not enough to conquer the hunger, but they were enough to make survival possible. Enough to carry life from one season to the next. But what happened when survival wasn't enough? When peasants began to question the system, the lords, the church, and perhaps even their food. That's where we'll pick up in the next section. The peasant's belly was never full, but it was always working, constantly digesting rough bread, boiled roots, and bitter herbs. Food in the Middle Ages was effort, it was survival, it was pain, and over time, hunger shaped not just bodies but minds. By the 14th century, the diet of the European peasant was more than just a fact of life, it was a measure of injustice. The rich feasted while the poor chewed bark-thick bread. It didn't take long for food to become more than sustenance. It became a symbol of oppression. Let's return to England post-Black Death. The population had plummeted, but with fewer mouths to feed, many survivors found themselves in unexpected abundance. Land was suddenly more available. Wages rose. Meat, previously a distant luxury, appeared more often on the peasant's table. But not everyone liked this shift. The nobility and landowning class, feeling their grip loosen, began enforcing old laws with new fervor. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. This was a desperate effort to preserve a system already cracking. But the real spark came in the form of taxation and bread. In the countryside, peasants who had enjoyed a brief period of better living saw their food security begin to slip again. Lords raised rents. The church demanded tithes, and the king demanded poll taxes, a flat rate per person regardless of income. It wasn't just unjust, it was destabilizing. At the same time, harvests faltered again, not dramatically but enough. A few bad summers, a few wet autumns, and suddenly the familiar pottage became thinner, the bread coarser, and the portions smaller. Again. What was once endured in silence now began to stir resentment. The diet of a peasant had always reflected hierarchy. The poor ate dark bread, often rye, sometimes barley, filled with bran, husks, and grit. The rich ate white bread, made from sifted wheat flour. It was baked in finer ovens and sold in bustling markets. The poor could only gaze at it. In some towns, this difference was not just culinary, it was legally enforced. In medieval France and England, sumptuary laws sometimes dictated who could eat what. Bakers, too, were watched. They were bound by the assize of bread, which controlled weight, size, and price. Violations could lead to fines, or the baker being publicly shamed, even dunked in a river on a pillory cart. When bread failed, towns failed. Urban riots were often sparked by shortages of affordable bread. In Paris, a sudden spike in bread prices led to street protests. In London, rumors of hoarded grain could empty entire markets within an hour. By the late 1300s, food was political. And then came 1381. The peasants' revolt, as it's now called, was a complex movement fueled by taxes, inequality, and class anger. But food played a central role. In villages and towns, rebels smashed tax records, burned manorial estates, and murdered officials. But they also demanded something deeply mundane, a better life and better food. In a sermon echoing through the streets of London, preacher John Ball asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" It was a question of equality, but also of entitlement, to land, to labor, and yes, to bread. The rebels wanted freedom from serfdom, but they also wanted access to fields, to forests, and to the means of feeding themselves. No more tithes, no more lords taking half the barley, no more fasting imposed from above. They were crushed, of course. The revolt ended in violence, hangings, and a restoration of the old order, but something had shifted. For the first time in centuries, the idea of fairness in food had been spoken aloud. And slowly, painfully, change followed. By the 15th century, tenancy arrangements evolved. More peasants rented land for wages. In some areas, they grew surplus and sold it. Regional markets emerged where formerly isolated villages began to trade excess beans, cheese, even small amounts of meat or ale. This modest economic flexibility made it possible for diets to improve, at least slightly. But this depended on geography. In Northern Europe, where wheat was harder to grow, rye remained dominant. Rye bread, sometimes mixed with oats or barley, was dark and tough. In Southern Europe, especially Italy and Spain, diets were broader: lentils, chickpeas, garlic, olives, and occasionally dried fish. Still, protein was rare. In times of desperation, peasants ate whatever moved: squirrels, hedgehogs, birds, even dogs. Bones unearthed from some village middens show butchery marks on animals never meant for consumption. Peasants also began to rely more heavily on gardens, tiny kitchen plots behind their homes. These grew onions, parsnips, spinach, and herbs like parsley or thyme. Not enough for full meals, but enough to flavor an otherwise bland porridge. Flavor, by the way, was a strange luxury. Most medieval peasant food was bland by necessity. Spices were out of reach. Salt was precious. Even vinegar was a rarity. The most common flavoring was leek or wild garlic, both easy to grow or forage. In some monastic records, we find recipes for pottage that include crumbled stale bread, cabbage, and ale, boiled together. It may sound grim, but in a cold winter it was survival. Occasionally, food could be joyful. A wedding might feature roast goose, boiled eggs, or honey cakes made from coarse flour and beforaged sweetness. On saints' days, a village might slaughter a pig, but these were holidays, blips in the relentless calendar of hunger. Still, the question lingers: why didn't peasants grow more food? The answer is simple and bleak: they weren't allowed. Land was not theirs. Even if a peasant managed to grow extra beans or barley, they owed a portion to the lord, the church, or the miller. In some regions, mills were legally monopolized by the manor. You couldn't even grind your own grain without paying a fee. Imagine this: you grow rye on your tiny plot. You harvest it by hand. You carry it to the manor mill. You wait in line. You pay a fee to grind it. You collect your flour, less than what you brought. And then you're taxed again on the loaf you bake. This wasn't just survival. It was a slow, grinding oppression, one bite at a time. So when peasants rebelled, or when they moved to cities seeking wage labor, it wasn't just about politics. It was about food. Bread, beans, barley, it was all they ever wanted, and it was always just out of reach. By the end of the medieval period, diets had begun to diversify slightly. In some areas, dairy became more common. Alehouses offered cheap meals. Markets brought access to dried fish, onions, and chickpeas. But hunger remained common. Malnutrition was normal, and food was still power. In the next section, we'll explore how religion and feast days, strangely enough, shaped both the hunger and hope of peasant diets. We'll explore why fish mattered more than you think, and why fasting didn't always mean eating less. Because in the strange calculus of medieval faith, salvation sometimes came in a bowl of lentils. To understand the final layers of the medieval peasant's diet, we must turn to something both deeply spiritual and surprisingly bureaucratic: the calendar of the church. Medieval Europe was a world not just of fields and lords, but of saints and fasts. And nothing shaped what a peasant ate, or didn't eat, more than the liturgical year. At first glance, it might seem that religious fasting meant less food. In truth, it meant different food, structured, sanctioned, and often peculiar. The church calendar prescribed over half the year as fasting days, including Lent, Advent, Ember Days, Rogation Days, and numerous vigils and Saints' Eves. On these days, Christians were expected to abstain from meat, sometimes from dairy and eggs too. For the poor, this didn't mean much. They rarely had meat to begin with. But for wealthier households, the restrictions were a significant shift. For peasants, however, these rules presented an odd inversion. Fast days were often days of relative abundance. Why? Because during these times, fish was allowed. In coastal areas or along rivers, this meant salt herring, eels, shellfish, and occasionally freshwater fish caught in streams. In some inland villages, ponds were constructed to raise fish specifically for religious observance. Monasteries, ever resourceful, maintained fish ponds with carp and pike. But peasants usually relied on the markets and the dried fish they could afford. Herring became the fasting fish of the working class. Salted, smoked, and stiff as a board, it could last months. It was not pleasant, but it was protein. A barrel of salted herring from the North Sea might pass through dozens of villages in a single Lent, sliced thin, served with cabbage or bread. The irony: fish was more accessible during fasts than meat was on feast days. And feast days, those were a different story. The church calendar included dozens, some regions hundreds of feast days. Some were tied to saints, others to agricultural rhythms. Harvest festivals, the feast of St. Martin when geese were eaten, or Christmas, when a pig might be slaughtered. Feast days were communal affairs. A village might share a roast animal, drink barley ale, bake flatcakes, and roast root vegetables. Musicians might appear. Children might taste honey or fruit, but these were exceptions, not the rule. In between, hunger returned. Still, the rhythm of fasting and feasting created a structure, however uneven, that gave peasants something to look forward to. The predictability of church mandates provided a strange kind of stability in a world where harvests were anything but stable. Even more curious was the theological justification of food. Medieval theology held that the body and soul were intimately connected. To eat too well was to invite gluttony. To fast, to abstain, to endure hunger, these were paths to sanctity. So in some sense, the peasant diet was not just economic. It was seen as spiritually correct. To be poor was not necessarily noble, but to suffer well, to eat modestly, to accept your lot, these were virtues. Monks and nuns often lived on simple fare: boiled pulses, hard bread, ale, and herbs. Some monastic orders forbade meat entirely. Others allowed fish but no butter or cheese. Meals were taken in silence, read aloud from scripture, and considered part of daily penance. Peasants, observing this, sometimes accepted their own hunger as a form of divine alignment. The idea that food was not meant for pleasure, but for discipline, became widespread. This belief shaped food laws too. During Lent, selling meat was illegal. Butchers closed shop. Bakers produced eggless loaves. Street food changed. Some towns passed ordinances fining those who ate or sold meat openly on fast days. And yet there was subversion. In wealthier circles, especially among nobility and church elites, fasting became elaborate cuisine. Dishes mimicked meat using fish or plant-based ingredients. Almond milk replaced dairy. Fish was molded into faux birds. In the court of Burgundy, Lent was not a season of suffering. It was a culinary performance. For the poor, this was incomprehensible. Lent meant watery pottage, boiled turnips, and dry bread. It meant no butter, no eggs, no joy. Still, the idea of divine reward sustained them. Suffering now meant salvation later. Hunger, they were told, was temporary, either until the next feast day or the next life. And yet through this religious framing, resilience formed. The shared ritual of fasting connected scattered villages. Everyone knew the schedule. Everyone adapted together. The absence of meat wasn't just a diet, it was a culture. But what about the people who didn't fast, who violated the food rules? They were watched, not only by priests but by neighbors. Communal enforcement was real. A woman caught cooking meat on Good Friday might face public shamming. A man who ate eggs during Lent could be denounced. Food was not private, it was policed. Even funerals had food customs. The sole loaf, a piece of bread given to the poor in honor of the dead, linked diet and afterlife. In some places, corpse cakes were baked and placed on the deceased, believed to absorb sins before being eaten by the mourners. So food wasn't just about eating, it was about meaning. The dull bean stew, the hard crust, the dried fish, they weren't just sustenance. They were symbols of poverty, of piety, of place in the world. And yet for all this symbolic weight, real hunger persisted. Malnutrition continued. Children died young. Adults grew old before their time. So as we close this story, let's reflect on the strange paradox of the medieval peasant's diet. It was a system of oppression, yet a structure of survival. A theology of suffering, yet a calendar of feasts. A bowl of boiled beans, yet a vessel of resilience. It wasn't flavorful, it wasn't fair, but it was enough most days to keep people alive. And from those dull, bitter meals, Europe's villages endured. They endured frost and famine, plague and tithe, sermon and sword. They endured because they had no choice. And because, sometimes, even a bowl of turnip pottage could taste like hope. You sit on a cold wooden bench. Your hands are folded in your lap. Before you is a bowl, stoneware, chipped at the rim, filled with thin broth. You are not allowed to speak. You do not look around. You wait. A monk has just struck the table with a wooden mallet. This is the signal. The meal has begun. Welcome to the medieval monastery, where food was never just food. It was ritual. It was sacrifice. It was a test of the soul. To understand how meals worked in these cloistered communities, we need to understand the rule. Specifically, the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed in some form by most Western European monasteries throughout the medieval period. This document dictated nearly every aspect of monastic life, including how and what monks could eat. Benedict did not intend for monks to starve. On the contrary, he allowed for 2 meals per day, with modest servings of bread, wine, cooked vegetables, and occasionally fruit or legumes. Meat was generally forbidden, especially from 4-legged animals, though fish was permitted, and the sick or elderly might be granted exceptions. But the food was always to be simple, bland, and restrained. No seasoning beyond salt, no variety beyond the season, no joy beyond the act of humility. And this wasn't mere asceticism, it was philosophy. The idea was that indulgent eating distracted the soul. Monks were meant to strip life to its essentials: work, prayer, contemplation, and the bare minimum required to survive. A monk who looked forward to dinner was a monk in spiritual danger. Meals were eaten in silence. This silence wasn't just for solemnity, it was an act of discipline. To break it without permission was considered a minor offense. Instead of speaking, monks communicated with hand signals, a rudimentary but effective system that varied between communities. And while they ate, another monk read aloud from scripture or from the writings of saints. This was called the collation, and it turned every meal into a kind of sermon. The voice was soft, unbroken, never rushed. Even if the broth was cold or the bread stale, you listened. You absorbed. You obeyed. Food preparation was itself an act of obedience. Monasteries maintained kitchens, bakehouses, and herb gardens, often staffed by designated lay brothers or novices. These were not chefs. They were servants of God, wielding ladles and knives instead of books and quills. A typical monastic kitchen produced vegetable pottages, lentil stews, coarse barley loaves, and occasionally porridge sweetened with honey if available. The herbs, like sage, thyme, or rue, were more medicinal than flavorful. Water was the standard drink, but Saint Benedict, recognizing human frailty, allowed a daily ration of wine, about half a bottle by modern standards. In northern climates, this was often replaced by weak ale. But these meals were not uniform. Different monastic orders had different interpretations of moderation. The Cistercians were strict. They avoided all meat and discouraged even fish on ordinary days. The Cluniacs, by contrast, were known and occasionally criticized for their more elaborate fare, including multiple courses and richer soups. Still, compared to secular nobility, even the most indulgent, monasteries served food that was plain, repetitive, and deeply seasonal. Let's take an example from a typical Benedictine monastery in 13th century England. Breakfast none. The first meal, taken after the mid-morning service, around 10 a.m., might consist of a ladle of vegetable pottage, onion, cabbage, lentils, a slice of barley bread, a small cup of watered wine, perhaps an apple or piece of cheese, if in season. The evening meal, after vespers just before sunset, might include a thicker broth or porridge, dried peas or beans, another slice of bread, occasionally dried or salted fish, a second cup of drink, and that was it. No snacks, no late meals, no private indulgence. Portions were strictly regulated. The cellarer, the monk responsible for provisions, kept detailed records of supplies. Waste was frowned upon. Gluttony was a sin. To eat more than your share was not just selfish, it was spiritually dangerous. If a monk fell ill, he was moved to the infirmary, where slightly richer food could be served: goat's milk, soft cheese, poached eggs. But this was tightly controlled, and abuse of this privilege was investigated. Despite this austerity, monasteries were often better fed than peasants. They grew their own crops, managed orchards, raised pigs and chickens for trade or feast days, and maintained fish ponds. This self-sufficiency meant they rarely starved, even in times of famine. They also practiced preservation techniques with surprising skill: drying, pickling, fermenting. Some monasteries were famed for their ale or cheese, which they sold to nearby towns. Others grew medical herbs, chamomile, fennel, comfrey, for both healing and seasoning. The year was also structured by religious feasts and fasts. During Lent, meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden. Meals were reduced to a single course. Fish, if available, was permitted, but only plain. Oil or almond milk might replace animal fats. Feast days were the rare exceptions. On these days, monks might eat roast fish with herbs, cheese or eggs, white bread made from wheat flour, sweetened cakes made from honey and nuts. But even then, the meal began and ended in silence, with readings, prayers, and ritual. Why such discipline? Because food was not neutral. In monastic thought, eating was a battleground, a daily test of humility, restraint, and obedience. To desire food too much was to slide toward sin. Even in abundance, a monk was to act as if he had little. This mindset was not universally praised. Outside the cloister, peasants sometimes resented the monks' well-stocked stores. During famines, monasteries were sometimes attacked or petitioned for food. Monks were expected to offer charity, but the extent varied widely. Still, monastic kitchens were among the most organized and literate in medieval Europe. Their records, preserved in charters, inventories, and manuals, give us some of the most detailed insight into food production before the modern era. These records speak of bushels of beans, kegs of ale, sacks of flour, and counts of eggs. They describe food not in recipes but in quantities: daily, seasonal, annual. And always there is order, because even the humble act of ladling soup into a bowl was governed by rule, by tradition, by silence. So what does this tell us? That in the monastery, food was function, faith, and framework. It was never just a meal. It was a prayer with a spoon. And yet, under all that structure, under all the fasting and discipline, there were moments of quiet satisfaction: a warm bowl on a cold morning, a crisp apple in autumn, A sliver of cheese passed silently down the table. Moments where the body, if not the soul, was briefly comforted. But what happens when this silence is broken? When monastic discipline slips, or when the outside world intrudes upon the table? That's where we'll go in the next section. The monastery was built to be a sanctuary. Walls thick, doors heavy, gardens orderly. But no wall, no vow could fully keep out the pressures of the world beyond. And so, even within these disciplined enclosures, the simplicity of the table began to strain. It didn't happen all at once. First, it was wealth. As monasteries accumulated land, donations, and political influence, their pantries began to expand. Wealthy patrons, hopping to secure salvation, left not just gold but cows, vineyards, and fisheries. Monasteries turned from humble communities into landed institutions, with barns, mills, and markets. With property came surplus, and with surplus came temptation. The rule of Saint Benedict still stood, but interpretation shifted. In Cluniac monasteries, especially during the 10th to 12th centuries, meals became more elaborate. Not gluttonous exactly, but structured around a finer sense of ritual. Courses were added. Bread was baked from white wheat. Stews became thicker. Meals were served in silver-plated dishes on feast days, all in silence, all in obedience, but the austerity softened. Cistercians pushed back. Founded in the late 11th century as a reform movement, they returned to strict observance. No meat, limited fish, hard labor, plain food. Their diet was famously minimal: beans, bread, water, greens. Even eggs were discouraged. But even the Cistercians struggled to keep wealth at bay. Because as these monasteries grew, they needed workers, lay brothers not bound to the full monastic rule. These men performed the harder labor, tending fields, managing livestock, brewing ale, and they needed more calories, so exceptions were made. Lay brothers often ate more generously than choir monks. They were granted meat on certain days and extra bread and cheese. This created a two-tier system: spiritual purity above, physical labor below. Tensions rose. The structure of equality, once central to monastic identity, was eroding, and it showed most clearly in the kitchen. Meanwhile, outside pressures mounted. As Europe urbanized in the High Middle Ages, monasteries became not just spiritual centers but economic hubs. They sold wine, cheese, ale, honey. They rented land. They collected tithes. They became landlords, and with that came criticism. Peasants, often underfed and overtaxed, began to view monastic abundance with suspicion. Why should monks, who preached humility, eat better than villagers? Why did their pantries stay full during famine? In response, some abbots attempted reform. Kitchens were audited, meals were simplified, but enforcement varied. In France and England, records show imported spices, pepper, saffron, cinnamon, beginning to appear in monastic inventories by the 13th century. Not in vast quantities, but enough to raise eyebrows. Some abbots claimed these were for hospitality, not monks. Indeed, monasteries were legally required to host travelers, especially pilgrims and the poor. Guest meals were usually better: richer stews, fresh bread, sometimes even roasted meat. These meals were separate, eaten in the guest hall, and served by designated monks. But the lines blurred. Sometimes monks themselves dined there. Sometimes those guest ingredients found their way into the cloister's stew. And in cities, mendicant orders, like the Franciscans, began to draw sharp contrasts. They lived among the poor, begged for food, and ate only what was given. They rejected stored wealth and accused older monasteries of hypocrisy. It wasn't just a theological debate. It was a question of the moral legitimacy of food. Meanwhile, records from abbey kitchens reveal interesting trends. At Westminster Abbey in the 14th century, monks were recorded receiving 2 meals a day, bread made from sifted wheat, pottage with peas and onions, cheese or soft curd, ale or weak wine, Fish on fast days, fresh or salted. On feast days, meals might include roasted goose or fowl, especially on Christmas or Easter. Spiced wine, soft cheese, cakes made with honey and dried fruit. Still, these meals were not gluttonous by modern standards. Portions were controlled. Seconds were rare. Meals remained communal, silent, spiritual. But scandals emerged. In the 14th and 15th centuries, some monasteries fell into corruption. Visitors reported lavish banquets, secret kitchens, monks fat with abundance. At Glastonbury, an English visitor noted that some monks dined with more elegance than local nobles. Such stories weren't always true, but they reflected growing discomfort with monastic wealth. And then came the disasters. Famine returned in cycles. Plague struck again and again. Monasteries that once fed the poor found themselves overwhelmed. Grain stores emptied. Kitchens fell silent. In some places, monks died faster than they could be replaced. After the Black Death, some communities never recovered. Others merged. Some opened their lands to tenant farmers, creating a more secular economy. And yet, even amid decline, the monastic rhythm of meals remained. The bell tolled, the reader read, the ladle stirred. Even as Europe changed. But perhaps the most significant change came from within. By the 15th century, new spiritual movements, the Brethren of the Common Life, for instance, advocated a return to true humility. They rejected elaborate meals, focused on communal living, silent prayer, and frugal diets. At the same time, printing and scholarship brought new attention to early texts. Reformers began to question monastic structures. Why so much food? Why such distinction between orders? Why had the kitchen grown so large? These questions grew louder in the early 16th century, on the eve of the Reformation. Martin Luther, himself once a monk, criticized not just the church's corruption, but its indulgences, including, at times, its food. Monasteries were accused of hoarding, of enjoying too much while the laity suffered. Soon, in Protestant regions, monasteries were dissolved, their land seized, their refectories silenced. Monastic cooking traditions were lost or absorbed into private estates. But not everywhere. In Catholic Europe, monasteries adapted, new orders emerged, simpler diets returned, and yet the core remained: a table, a bowl, a silent meal. Because in the end, monastic food was never just about nutrition. It was about obedience, about humility, about seeing the body not as a master but a servant of the soul. A spoonful of broth taken in silence could mean more than a banquet. And in that silence, even amid the pressures of reform, wealth, or disaster, the spiritual discipline of the table endured. But the world outside had changed forever. The old rhythms, feast, fast, silence, soup, were no longer unquestioned. And as we'll explore in the next and final section, monasteries had to choose: return to true simplicity or evolve into something new. A monk in the early 16th century still rose before dawn, still chanted the divine office, still filed silently into the refectory, and still consumed his bowl of barley pottage or boiled lentils beneath the echo of sacred reading. But outside his cloister walls, Europe was on fire, not literally, but spiritually, politically, and ideologically. The quiet table was about to be upended by a loud world. In Catholic regions, monasteries continued as they had for centuries, though many were in slow decline. Meanwhile, in places touched by the Protestant Reformation, the age of the monastic meal was ending. To reformers like Martin Luther, a former Augustinian monk, monastic life was not just irrelevant, it was misguided. The vows of silence, celibacy, and communal living were seen as works-based righteousness, not true faith. The rigid fasting, the layers of feast day dietary codes, the careful abstinence, it all felt like a performance. Luther wrote with particular skepticism about the hypocrisy of fasting. where wealthier monasteries prepared elaborate fish dishes while claiming piety. He argued that God did not require culinary gymnastics to be pleased. In the decades that followed, thousands of monasteries were closed or destroyed, especially in regions that adopted Protestantism: Germany, Scandinavia, parts of Switzerland, and England. This wasn't just a spiritual decision. It was political, economic, and culinary. In England, under Henry VIII, the dissolution of the monasteries, 1536–1541, dismantled centuries of cloistered life. Abbey kitchens fell cold. Granaries were emptied. Lands were seized and redistributed. Former monks and lay brothers scattered, often becoming secular clergy, scholars, or laborers. These monastic kitchens had not only fed monks, but also the poor, travelers, and the sick. Their absence left a vacuum. Some communities tried to replace the charitable function of monastic food distribution with parish-based alms systems, but they lacked the structure and scale of monastic hospitality. More subtly, something else was lost: a culture of communal silence and spiritual eating. In the post-Reformation world, food became more domestic, more private. The idea that every meal was part of a religious rhythm faded for many. Fasting days lost their grip. The rules of who could eat what and when were simplified or ignored entirely. But not everywhere. In Catholic Europe, especially in Spain, Italy, and southern France, monasteries adapted rather than disappeared. Some embraced even stricter forms of fasting. The Carthusians, for example, ate no meat at all, ever. Their daily fare in the 17th century was simpler than many peasants: vegetables, water, dry bread. Yet it was chosen, not imposed, a statement of spiritual endurance. Other monasteries became known for craftsmanship and culinary skill. Benedictine and Trappist orders perfected the making of cheese, beer, and herbal liqueurs. Their kitchens didn't die, they evolved. Food, once a battleground of the soul, became a heritage of discipline. Even today, some monastic communities continue these traditions. Trappist beers are brewed in silence. Monastic bread is baked by hand. Meals are taken together, still often in silence, still often begun with prayer and still with readings. Not from saints this time, but sometimes from news of the world or commentary on scripture. The modern monastic meal is no longer about denying the body entirely, but about reordering the body's role. Let's consider the Cistercians of the strict observance, Trappists in modern France. Their daily menu, based on ancient practice, might include: morning, oatmeal or semolina with a piece of fruit; midday, vegetable soup, bread, seasonal salad, cheese; evening, light broth, a piece of fruit or yogurt, sometimes tea. All meals taken in silence with readings. Compare this with medieval monastic records from the 13th century, and you'll see a remarkable continuity, not in ingredients, but in intent. The goal remains the same: to eat not for pleasure, but for function, to recognize the act of eating as part of a disciplined, spiritual life. So what do we take from this story of silence and soup? First, that structure matters. For over 1,000 years, monasteries fed thousands: monks, peasants, and travelers, not with abundance but with consistency. Their kitchens ran on schedules, on purpose, on minimalism. Second, that power creates pressure. As monasteries grew wealthy, their discipline wavered. Their meals grew richer. Their reputations suffered. And eventually, some fell under the weight of their own stored grain. Third, that ritual can sustain communities even in poverty. The silence of the table, the reading from scripture, the equality of the bowl, these created bonds stronger than mere hunger. And finally, that legacy lingers. In the architecture of old refectories, in the recipes passed down, in the monastic ales on store shelves, in the quiet prayer before a shared meal. Even in a world that rarely pauses, where food is fast and fleeting, echoes remain. the echo of a spoon in a stone bowl, the echo of scripture spoken over soup, the echo of hunger, not just for food but for meaning. Monasteries may not rule the fields anymore, but their rhythm remains a quiet pulse in the background of history, a reminder that food, even when boiled and bland, can be sacred. Even when boring, it can be profound. When you think of trade in medieval Europe, you might picture ships loaded with silks and spices, or bustling markets beneath castle walls. But the real power, silent, granular, invisible, came in the form of something far more ordinary: salt. Salt, the dry, scratchy crystal scraped from coasts or mined from deep underground. White, bland, and everywhere except when it was. In the Middle Ages, salt was life and death. It was preservation. It was taxation. It was power. Before refrigeration, salt was the only real way to store food. It kept meat from spoiling. It cured fish. It preserved cheese. Without it, large-scale food storage simply didn't exist. And because food security meant survival, whoever controlled the salt controlled everything. Let's start at the source. Europe's salt came from two main types: sea salt and rock salt. Sea salt was harvested along coastlines, most famously in places like Venice, Brittany, and the Bay of Biscay. Salt pans, shallow pools that allowed seawater to evaporate, were built and maintained with painstaking care. The process was slow. Water was channeled, left to sit under the sun, scraped carefully by hand, and dried. Rain could ruin the whole harvest. Rock salt, meanwhile, was mined inland. The most famous source was Salzburg, whose very name means salt castle. There, miners carved tunnels deep into the Alps, extracting blocks of crystalline salt. These were crushed, washed, and sold far and wide. Salt production was dangerous, backbreaking, and controlled by guilds, lords, or municipalities, never the workers themselves. And yet salt was everywhere in daily life. A peasant in central France, for example, might have one salted fish per week, a small lump of salted pork for winter, and salt for baking bread. A little went a long way, but getting that little was the hard part. Because salt was not free, not even close. In France, salt was governed by the gabelle, one of the most hated taxes in European history. Instituted in the 14th century, it made salt both a commodity and a weapon. The crown fixed the price, controlled the distribution, and made it illegal to buy salt from any unauthorized source. Smuggling salt became common. Punishments were harsh: fines, imprisonment, even death. But people did it anyway. Because without salt, they couldn't preserve food, especially during winter or famine. The choice wasn't just between legality and crime. It was between eating or not eating. In England, salt was slightly more accessible, particularly from Cheshire, where massive rock salt deposits were exploited by the 13th century. Salt was also imported from Bayonne in France or shipped from the Iberian coast. But transportation was difficult. Salt was heavy. It had to be packed carefully to avoid moisture. It traveled by cart, mule, or boat and passed through dozens of toll stations, each exacting a fee. These trade routes became known as salt roads, long, well-worn paths cutting across Europe. One of the most famous was the Via Salaria in Italy, used since Roman times, which connected saltworks near the Adriatic to inland cities. Salt roads were not glamorous. They were dusty, dangerous, and dull. Merchants trudged slowly, avoiding robbers, bribing guards, and praying their goods didn't spoil in the rain. But they were essential. Salt trade was so profitable that cities formed alliances and leagues to protect it. The Hanseatic League, a network of northern European cities, thrived in part because of salted fish and herring exports. Salt made preservation possible, which made trade possible, which made urban markets and wealth possible. But salt was more than food. It was ceremonial. In many cultures, salt symbolized purity, loyalty, permanence. Monasteries used it in rituals. Nobles offered it at banquets as a status marker. the salt cellar placed near the head of the table, far from lower-ranking guests. Salt was also used to seal agreements. A handshake over salt was considered unbreakable. And so, the control of salt became a quiet form of governance. In Venice, salt was so critical that the city-state established a state monopoly on production. It built vast salt pans in the laguna and forbade anyone else from manufacturing it. This control helped fund the Venetian navy, build public works, and maintain the city's status as a Mediterranean powerhouse. In some places, salt was paid as wages. Roman soldiers, earlier than the medieval era, had received a salarium, a salt allowance. The word salary traces its etymology to this practice. In the medieval period, some lords continued the tradition, offering salt rations to household servants or retainers. It was that valuable. But for ordinary people, salt was always a barrier: economic, geographic, political. Imagine a poor family in 14th century Bavaria. They need salt to cure pork for winter. The nearest legal source is 2 towns over, and they must pay a toll at each bridge. The cost is higher than the meat itself. Do they risk buying from a smuggler? Or do they go without, hoping the meat will last until Christmas? This was not a rare dilemma. It was daily life. And then came war. During conflicts, salt roads were prime targets. Armies raided salt stores. Cities blockaded rivals. In some sieges, defenders held out not just for bread or water, but for salt, because without it, their stored food would spoil. It was invisible in the annals of military history, but critical to survival. Even diplomacy turned on salt. Alliances were built on salt trade agreements. Marriage dowries sometimes included salt rights. In some treaties, clauses explicitly protected salt merchants. The spice trade, more glamorous, more dramatic, gets more attention, but salt built the system. Without salt, dried cod from Norway could not reach Portugal. Without salt, French cheese could not be stored. Without salt, peasants could not endure winter, sailors could not survive voyages, and cities could not feed their poor. And so this humble crystal, mined by candlelight or evaporated under the sun, became a quiet king. It funded wars, it built roads, it provoked revolts, it salted flesh and cemented faith. But what happens when this power is challenged? When another substance, rare, colorful, flavorful, starts to arrive from the east? When traders begin to risk everything for something that can't preserve food but can transform it? That's where we'll go in the next section, as we turn from salt to spice. Salt kept food from spoiling. It kept armies fed, monasteries disciplined, and peasants barely alive. But it didn't make anything taste good. For that, medieval Europe turned its eyes east. Welcome to the spice trade, a long, dusty, dangerous highway stretching thousands of miles from the Indies to the ports of Venice and Genoa. It was a system as intricate as it was invisible to most of the people it fed. To them, spices were magic, flavors from far-off lands, promises of luxury in a world of cabbage and old bread. But despite their exotic aura, spices entered Europe in ways that were, well, boring. They came on camel caravans, on ocean-going dhows, in sacks marked not with kings' crests but merchant guild symbols. They came through bargaining, risk, taxes, tolls, and contracts. Spices were excitement delivered by bureaucracy. Let's start with pepper, the most mundane and most important of them all. Grown on vines in southwestern India, pepper was dried and shipped in bundles across the Indian Ocean. It passed through the Arabian Peninsula, into the hands of Persian and Syrian merchants, then up to Constantinople, and across to Venice or Genoa. By the time pepper reached your table in London or Paris, its price had multiplied dozens of times. And still, it was in high demand. Why? Because in a world of boiled turnips, barley porridge, and dry fish, pepper was life-changing. It made bad food tolerable. It covered the taste of slightly spoiled meat. It symbolized sophistication. To own pepper was to declare, "I am someone." And pepper was just the beginning. By the 12th century, wealthy households also sought cinnamon, actually cassia bark from Sri Lanka and China, cloves from the Maluku Islands, modern Indonesia, nutmeg also from the Indonesian archipelago, ginger from India and Southeast Asia, saffron from Persia and Spain, though costly to grow, galangal, a sharp root like ginger, used in sauces. These spices were expensive, very expensive. In some places, pepper was kept under lock and key. Nobles measured it by the grain. A pound of cloves might cost the equivalent of a peasant's monthly wage, yet demand remained. And it wasn't just about flavor. Spices were also valued as medicines, ginger for digestion, cinnamon for colds, preservatives, less effective than salt but useful, status symbols displayed in ornate boxes, used in perfumed wine, religious offerings, incense was traded alongside spices. But here's the twist. Few Europeans had any idea where spices actually came from. To most medieval consumers, the East was a vague blur of fabled lands. India, Cathay, China, Prester John's kingdom, the Spice Islands. Some thought pepper grew in dragon-guarded forests. Others believed nutmeg trees required special birds to plant their seeds. Maps labeled spice-producing regions with warnings. Here be serpents. In truth, the journey of spices was a logistical miracle. Arab and Persian traders dominated the early routes, passing goods through cities like Baghdad, Basra, Alexandria, and Antioch. From there, goods were ferried across the Mediterranean, first to Byzantine ports, then to Venetian and Genoese merchants, who sold them to the rest of Europe. By the High Middle Ages, Italian city-states had effectively cornered the European spice trade. Venice, in particular, grew rich on its monopoly. Venetian merchants purchased spices in Mamluk Egypt, marked them up, and sold them to France, Germany, England, and the Low Countries. This created a price bottleneck. Every middleman took a cut. Every border exacted a toll. Every local ruler demanded a bribe. By the time nutmeg reached Bruges, its price had increased 100-fold, and still people bought it. So who could afford spices? Mostly the wealthy elite, nobles, merchants, church officials. A noble's kitchen might use spices to flavor sauces, meat pies, sweetened wines, and even desserts. Monasteries, though typically frugal, sometimes use small amounts for feast day meals or medicinal purposes. Spices even appeared in cookbooks, like the 14th century form of curry, commissioned by the royal household of England. These recipes included pottage thickened with breadcrumbs and spiced with saffron, mace, and ginger, flavors a commoner would never taste. Yet trickle-down did occur. Apothecaries sold powdered pepper or cinnamon in tiny quantities, sometimes as part of a tonic. Urban cookshops occasionally used a dusting of ginger to mask bad meat, and when returning crusaders brought back spices as souvenirs, some found their way into local dishes. But spices weren't just eaten, they were counted. In medieval account books, spices were tracked like currency. Debts were paid in cloves. Rents were offset with saffron. Dowries included pepper. Ships' cargo manifests read like grocery lists for a fantasy king. And so trade routes solidified. Overland, the Silk Road linked China to the Mediterranean, though rarely traveled from end to end by any single merchant. Goods passed hands many times, each transfer wrapped in tax and custom. By sea, routes extended from India to Arabia, then through the Red Sea or Persian Gulf into the Mediterranean. The spice fleets of the Indian Ocean followed monsoon winds, creating a seasonal rhythm to global trade long before the age of exploration. But this system had limits. It was expensive. It was slow. It relied on political stability in dozens of regions, and it made Europe dependent on Arab merchants, on Eastern kingdoms, on Italian port cities. This dependence grew into frustration. By the 15th century, European monarchs began dreaming of a solution: cut out the middleman, reach the spice lands directly, find a sea route to the east. Thus began the age of exploration. Portuguese navigators pushed down the coast of Africa. Spanish ships headed west. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. A few years later, Portuguese ships began bringing pepper, cinnamon, and cloves back directly to Lisbon, bypassing the Venetians entirely. This changed everything. Prices dropped slightly. Supply increased briefly, and European powers began to carve out colonial footholds not for conquest at first, but for control of flavor. And so, salt may have built Europe's trade infrastructure, but spices redirected its history. Because the quest for spice funded ships, provoked wars, sparked diplomacy, and birthed empire. But even before all that, it shaped the daily lives of medieval people, less through consumption and more through aspiration. The smell of pepper in a stew was not just pleasant, it was rare, expensive, sacred. The taste of ginger in wine wasn't just enjoyable, it was foreign, holy, powerful. Spices weren't just seasonings, they were status, they were the future, they were desire, packed in sacks and shipped across the world. But what about the people who moved these goods? The merchants, packers, guards, and mule drivers who kept this invisible empire running. In the next section, we'll step off the trade route and into the daily life of a medieval spice merchant, where business, danger, and tedium collided beneath the scent of cinnamon. The spice trade may evoke images of golden caravans, gilded ledgers, and silk-robed traders under eastern suns. But for most medieval merchants, it meant long hours, creaking wagons, and the constant, dull grind of paperwork, tolls, and negotiations. Behind every spoonful of cinnamon in a noble stew, behind every peppercorn on a royal table, was the endless labor of logistics. Let's meet the medieval spice merchant, not the glamorous explorer or aristocrat, but the working merchant in 14th century Bruges or Genoa. His life was defined not by exotic lands, but by custom duties, market regulations, and the weather. A successful merchant needed three things: capital to buy goods up front, often borrowed at interest; connection with shipowners, local guilds, foreign partners; patience, because most profits came after months or even years. Imagine you are this merchant. You've taken out a loan from a local moneylender. You've pooled funds with two partners. You've bought a cargo of pepper, cloves, and ginger from a Venetian wholesaler, freshly offloaded from Alexandria. The goods are packed in linen sacks, stitched and sealed, marked with wax stamps. You log every weight. You document every cost: customs at the port, warehouse storage fees, carriage hire. Each movement of the cargo must be accounted for, because every toll house, city gate, or bridge along the way will demand its cut. And there are many cuts. In the Holy Roman Empire, goods pass through a patchwork of toll zones. Each city-state, bishopric, or petty lord had their own tariffs, often inconsistent, sometimes illegal, always tedious. You could carry pepper for 5 days and pay 10 times its value in tolls if you didn't negotiate carefully or know the right people. Even more frustrating, these taxes weren't always in coin. Some places demanded a portion of your goods, a pound of pepper here, a roll of cloth there. These small slices added up. Merchants had a saying: "The devil doesn't ride, he waits at the next toll gate." Once you reach your destination, say Paris or Ghent, the goods must be inspected and weighed by local guild officials. If your sacks seem light, you may be fined. If they seem too full, you may be accused of fraud. Peppercorns are weighed by the ounce, not by the fistful. Errors mean accusations. Accusations mean ruin. You pay stall fees to set up a booth in the market. You pay guard fees to protect your stock overnight. You may even pay a guild middleman to broker your deals, especially if you're a foreigner. Then comes the hardest part: Finding buyers. You haggle with chefs for noble houses, monastery stewards, wealthy widows, and urban spice shops. Some buy in bulk, others want only a few ounces. You sell ginger by the root, cinnamon by the stick, pepper by the dozen grains. Saffron is stored in glass vials or wax-sealed boxes, each one labeled like treasure. Your profits, modest, a few percent if all goes well. A fortune, maybe, if you're bold enough to take risks, ship spices to England in winter or trade inland during a plague year. But just as often, the profit is eaten by spoilage, theft, or political chaos. Because a merchant's greatest enemy is not the competitor, it is instability. A storm at sea could sink your cargo. A border skirmish could close a trade route. A new tariff could wipe out your margin overnight. Merchants, despite their rising wealth, held no real power. They depended on the goodwill of lords and city councils, many of whom resented their mobility and growing influence. And yet merchants endured, because trade offered something no other medieval occupation could: upward mobility. A successful spice merchant might marry into nobility. He might fund a city church. He might have his children educated. And he might, with enough luck and ledgers, become a banker, a landowner, or a magistrate. But even the wealthiest spice traders lived close to risk. Consider the Peruzzi and Bardi families of Florence, famous merchant banking dynasties. Both collapsed in the 14th century due to unpaid debts from monarchs and war losses. And not all merchants were men. In cities like Bruges, Lubeck, and Paris, widows of spice merchants sometimes took over businesses, managing inventory and credit themselves. Some cities allowed women to join merchant guilds. Their ledgers, carefully maintained, are among the most detailed historical records we have. They listed price per ounce of cloves, losses from spoiled ginger, toll bribes paid in dried fruit, debts owed by monasteries or noble houses, wages for guards, scribes, and apprentices. So where did all this careful calculation lead? To influence. By the 15th century, merchant guilds shaped city policies. They funded walls and roads. They negotiated with rulers. In Venice, the Council of Ten, one of the most powerful governing bodies, was filled with merchants. In Bruges, merchant halls were more imposing than some cathedrals. But they rarely left the shadows. Unlike knights or clergy, merchants were not glorified in songs. Their power was quiet, written in contracts and crates. And their lives remained full of repetition. Weigh, list, pay, travel, wait, haggle, pay again. It was boring, risky, frustrating. But it kept Europe fed, flavored, and connected. From a merchant's burden came the beginnings of a market economy. And from sacks of spices came the first capitalist fortunes, built not on conquest but on careful accounting. And so the taste of cinnamon on a winter's roast was not just flavor, it was paperwork. The clove in your pear stew was a receipt, a toll stub, a ledger entry. It was global trade, one boring grain at a time. In our next story, we'll leave the merchants and traders behind and step into the grand halls of the nobility, where food was about spectacle, not survival, and where the difference between feasting and famine was a matter of who sat at the head of the table. It is winter in 13th century France. Outside the manor walls, the fields are silent, frozen, and barren. A peasant family huddles around a hearth, chewing on coarse bread made from rye and crushed beans boiled in water. There's no salt, no meat, just warmth and repetition. But inside the great hall of the local lord's estate, a very different meal is underway. The table groans under roasted game, pies heavy with lard and saffron, candied fruit, and wine thick with spice. Servants slice, pour, and present each course with practiced grace. This is not gluttony, at least not as it was understood then. This is power on a plate. This is feasting, a deliberate, orchestrated act of status, control, and inequality. Welcome to the medieval noble's table. Welcome to the brutal contrast between abundance and absence, between feast and famine, between those who ruled and those who harvested. In medieval Europe, food was not just sustenance. It was hierarchy, ceremony, and identity. And nowhere was this clearer than in the daily contrast between the diet of the peasant and that of the noble class. Let's begin with the structure of noble meals. Unlike peasants who often ate from a single pot, nobles dined in courses. Meals were planned and paced. Even a modest dinner might include a salad of fresh herbs and vinegar, roasted meats, pork, capon, rabbit, or swan, pottages thickened with almonds or breadcrumbs, fish dishes especially during fasts, like baked pike or salted herring, sweet and savory pies filled with minced meats, spices, and fruit, honey cakes, marzipan, candied nuts, wine, mead, and spiced ale in silver or pewter goblets. And then there were entremets, elaborate dishes served between courses purely for display, a roast peacock redressed in its own feathers, a pie that released live birds when cut open, a tower of sugared fruits balanced on a pastry base. These weren't just for taste. They were statements of wealth, of culinary artisanship, and of dominion over both land and labor. Because nobles didn't make this food, they commanded it. Cooks, bakers, butchers, brewers, and servers, many of them specialized servants, prepared the meals. The kitchen staff in a major household could number in the dozens, each with their own hierarchy. The master cook, the saucier, the scullions. Above them all, the steward, who managed supplies, costs, and feast planning. Where did the ingredients come from? From the peasants. Rents were often paid in food: chickens, eggs, cheese, grain. Even hunting rights were restricted. In most regions, commoners were forbidden to hunt large game. A rabbit snared in the wrong wood could cost a peasant his hand. So, while peasants ate dried beans and cabbage, the lords ate the best of the land, often gathered from the very tenants who labored it. Seasonality did matter. Winter feasts relied on preserved meat, dried fruits, and root vegetables. But even then, noble stores were deeper. Their food was salted, smoked, or pickled in expensive ceramic jars. They had ice pits, stone larders, and access to preserved goods via trade. In summer, the bounty widened. Fresh herbs, young meats, river fish, berries, milk. And always there were spices. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, nutmeg, even when used sparingly, were crucial, not just for flavor but for prestige. To serve spiced wine or a sweet ginger pudding was to declare one's rank. These spices had traveled thousands of miles and cost as much as livestock. But this abundance was more than personal pleasure. It was political theater. Feasts were public events, used to honor guests, secure loyalty, and display a lord's power. A wedding banquet might last for 3 days. A coronation could feed 2,000. Chronicles detail menus like war campaigns, listing how many oxen, geese, and barrels of ale were needed. At one banquet for King Edward I, over 1,000 gallons of wine were consumed. At the wedding of Charles IV of France, 28 swans were roasted. When Richard II dined, his cooks prepared multiple meats per guest, each presented with separate sauces. These spectacles required planning, labor, and enormous quantities of food, while famine sometimes raged only a few miles away. This disconnect was not lost on chroniclers or on commoners. In times of hunger, food riots often targeted noble estates. Monasteries, too, sometimes faced backlash for well-stocked kitchens. Though the church preached humility, many abbots dined in comfort. Their pantries were deep, their refectories warmed by braziers. Still, nobles defended their meals not as excess, but as duty. A great lord was expected to host generously, to feed his retainers, to nourish guests, to show divine favor through bounty. To eat plainly was seen, in some circles, as dishonor or weakness. Thus, food became a performance of legitimacy. And yet famine still came. In 1315–1317, during the Great Famine, crop failures swept across northern Europe. Thousands died of starvation or disease. But while peasants foraged bark and roots, noble feasts continued, though more modestly. Even in scarcity, lords had priority access to surviving stores. Because food was not distributed by need, it was distributed by social contract. This contrast between empty bowls and overflowing trenchers did not always spark rebellion. The system was seen as divinely ordered. The rich ruled because God willed it. The poor labored because it was their lot. But cracks appeared. As towns grew and merchant classes expanded, some commoners gained access to foods once reserved for nobility. Spices trickled down. Game birds appeared in market stalls. Wine replaced ale for some urban families. In response, sumptuary laws were passed. These laws regulated who could eat what and how. In England, only nobles of a certain rank could eat roast swan or peacock. In Italy, laws limited the number of courses served at private feasts. In France, citizens were forbidden to use gold or silver utensils unless titled. These laws weren't always enforced, but they expressed anxiety. The elite feared losing their food-based distinction. If everyone could eat spiced venison, what separated a knight from a merchant? Still, these laws didn't close the gap. They merely underlined it. Because for most people, especially rural peasants, feast was fantasy. Food remained functional. Scarcity was seasonal. Hunger, especially in winter and during bad harvests, was routine. In some regions, peasants were required to contribute additional labor during noble feasts, collecting herbs, grinding flour, slaughtering animals. They cooked what they would never taste. And when the feast was over, the scraps were theirs, sometimes. In larger estates, alms feasts distributed leftovers to the poor, but these were not acts of equality. They were reminders of place. Still, food told the truth. A belly full of goose and honeyed pears meant you were above. A stomach cramping from boiled weeds meant you were below. The divide was visible in the food. The inequality was chewed and swallowed. The power was plated, one course at a time. But what happened when those roles blurred? When a famine stripped even nobles of their roast, or when a rich merchant outfeasted a baron? In the next section, we'll follow the moments when this carefully plated system began to bend, when feasting faltered, and the illusion of noble permanence began to crack. In the tapestry of medieval life, the noble feast was stitched in gold, opulent, ordered, and unchanging. But the thread was more fragile than it seemed. As Europe staggered through plagues, wars, and economic upheavals, even the richest tables began to feel tremors. What happens when abundance meets adversity? When a culture built on display and ritual must reckon with empty granaries, dying laborers, and restless tenants? It begins slowly. A missing ingredient, a shortened course, a guest who does arrive. The 14th century was especially hard on the illusion of permanence. Following the Great Famine, 1315–1317, noble households found themselves paying more for less. Crop failures led to steep prices for grain, meat, and even staples like onions and dried beans. The winter stores didn't stretch as far. Salted meats spoiled more quickly. The lords still feasted, but fewer times per week, with fewer dishes and with more emphasis on display over substance. A roasted swan remained a symbol of wealth, even if it was accompanied by watered wine and half-filled trenchers. And then in 1347 came the Black Death. The plague changed everything, not just demography but dinner. When entire villages emptied and servants died in their beds, nobles faced a new reality. There were not enough hands to prepare the food. The kitchen, once bustling with scullions, bakers, and turnspits, grew quiet. Game went untrapped. Bread went unbaked. The feast faltered, not from lack of ingredients, but from lack of people. Suddenly, labor was precious. Surviving servants demanded wages. Skilled cooks left for higher-paying posts in towns. Meat carvers became negotiators, and the nobility, used to command without contest, had to compete. Some responded with bribery, offering double pay or better housing. Others responded with coercion, trying to reinforce the manorial structure through legal codes. In England, this culminated in the Statute of Labourers, 1351, a law designed to freeze wages and tie workers to their lords. But it failed. Peasants had tasted leverage, and they weren't giving it back. For noble households, this labor crisis meant shrinking feasts. Some menus dropped from 10 courses to 5. Some households reduced daily meals from 2 to 1. Leftovers, once given as alms, were now reheated and served again. A 14th century steward's manual from a French chateau reveals careful notes on how to stretch wine with spiced water, substitute salted mutton for fresh beef, use the older goose in place of chicken, cut fish thinly to serve more guests with less. These weren't desperate measures. They were adjustments, subtle shifts that showed the system knew its limits. Yet even in decline, nobles clung to symbolic excess. A noble might serve only 3 meats instead of 5, but they would still be presented with gilded garnishes and sweet sauces. A reduced wine cellar would still include imported clarets, even if fewer bottles were opened. Why? Because feasting wasn't just about food, it was about face. A noble had to maintain appearances before his peers, retainers, and vassals. To serve thin stew was not just a culinary failure, it was a political embarrassment. And yet, as merchants and townsfolk grew wealthier, feasting lost its monopoly on nobility. Urban guilds began to host elaborate banquets. Rich cloth merchants and bankers in cities like Bruges, Florence, and Lubeck mimicked noble dining, sometimes exceeding it. Their halls were filled with roast venison, sugared almonds, and wine-soaked pastries. They hired the same cooks, bought the same spices. Some even commissioned illuminated menus, a practice once reserved for kings. In response, noble families passed sumptuary laws, trying to restrict the right to serve certain foods. In Florence, a 1363 ordinance forbade citizens from serving more than 3 courses. In England, commoners were forbidden to eat swans, herons, or sturgeon. In Castile, anyone not of noble blood caught serving saffron cakes could be fined or worse. But enforcement was lax. Merchants paid the fines and continued to dine like dukes. This creeping equality, at the table at least, undermined the fiestas hierarchy model. And while nobles worried about status, peasants worried about survival. Famine remained a constant threat. During bad years, noble larders might grow lean, but peasant bellies emptied completely. Malnutrition rose. So did resentment. By the late 14th century, social tensions spilled over. In 1381, the peasants' revolt in England targeted not just landowners, but their symbols, the manor house, the tax rolls, and the food stores. Chroniclers recorded rebels ransacking kitchens, breaking open larders, and burning feast tables. Similar uprisings occurred across Europe, France's Jacquerie, the German Buncha movements, and urban riots in Flanders and Italy. Food wasn't the only issue, but it was always present. Rebels didn't just demand land or wages. They demanded a better diet, or at least the right not to starve. Still, the feasting class endured. Through marriage, warfare, and inheritance, noble estates consolidated. Smaller houses faded. Larger houses feasted harder, often with royal subsidy or church patronage. The balance tipped again in the 15th century with the rise of court culture. In places like Burgundy, Castile, and the Holy Roman Empire, feasting became institutionalized. Professional kitchens employed dozens. Menus were crafted by scribes. Banquets followed protocols of service. Who sat where, who was served first, how many dishes per guest. This formalization did not trickle down. The gap between lavish spectacle and rural emptiness remained stark. And yet the spectacle was increasingly hollow. A noble could host 1,000 guests, but still worry about grain yields. He could feast on boar and ginger, but fear the loyalty of his cooks. The illusion of control slipped. Food, once a symbol of eternal hierarchy, had become a negotiated performance. In the next section, we'll explore how this performance evolved into something new. How, by the dawn of the early modern period, feasting became political propaganda, and the noble table transformed into a weapon of image in a world teetering toward revolution. By the 15th century, the noble feast had shifted from indulgent celebration to something more deliberate, more calculated. It was no longer just about eating. It was about being seen eating, and being seen eating in a particular way. Feasting had become propaganda. In the great courts of Europe, Burgundy, Castile, France, the Holy Roman Empire, the table was now a tool of statecraft. The size of the roast, the sweetness of the wine, the number of peacocks per course, these were not just details. They were messages. Power was no longer only shown through armies or castles. It was also shown through menus. And yet just beyond the gates of these palaces, the hunger remained. Let's take the court of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. In the 1440s, his banquets were legendary. One recorded feast served 300 swans, 50 boars, dozens of sugar sculpture shaped like saints and castles, towers of glazed fruit and marzipan animals, a flowing fountain of wine in the center of the hall. The guest list included nobles, foreign envoys, churchmen, and wealthy merchants. These events weren't random. They were carefully orchestrated performances of legitimacy. Each course reinforced the idea. The Duke was generous, pious, mighty, and above all, secure. But securing this image required enormous logistics. Cooks had to coordinate with hunters, fishmongers, spice merchants, and scribes. Even painters were hired to design edible table displays. Recipes were not simply improvised. They were copied, illuminated, and preserved as intellectual property. This form of spectacle created its own kind of pressure. Because not all nobles could keep up. For minor lords or struggling barons, the expectation to host, appropriately, became burdensome. They might mortgage land or borrow heavily just to stage a wedding feast that wouldn't disgrace their name. Some defaulted on debts. Others leaned harder on their peasants, raising rents, demanding more grain, extending labor services. Feasts at the top caused famines at the bottom. Even when food was technically available, it became inaccessible. In Paris, Milan, or Cologne, inflation meant basic goods like flour or meat could be priced out of reach for the lower classes during periods of noble extravagance. Meanwhile, the middle class, merchants, notaries, civic officials, began to emulate the feasting elite. They couldn't serve peacock, but they could serve pigeon. They couldn't afford saffron, but they could afford ginger. In urban centers, this growing class adopted dining as a performance of aspiration, less to rival the nobles and more to reflect their own rising status. Cookbooks began to circulate in printed form. One of the earliest, the Libro d'Arte Coquinaria by Martino de Camò, c. 1465, combined elite flavors with more accessible ingredients. These books marked a shift. Culinary knowledge was no longer secret. It was now cultural capital. But while feasting had evolved into image-making, famine was evolving too. Famine in the early modern period was no longer just natural, it was increasingly economic. Grain was hoarded, speculated upon, and traded internationally. When crops failed, prices soared, not because food disappeared, but because the system pushed it away from those who couldn't afford it. During a bad year, peasants in rural France might eat boiled grass or oak bark, while grain was exported to wealthier towns. And yet the spectacle of feasting continued. The contrast became starker. The idea that God had ordained this inequality began to falter. Preachers, especially reformers, began to condemn feasting as sinful. Martin Luther criticized both church and noble excess, noting that many dined not to live, but to impress. Calvinists in the Low Countries promoted austerity, and in England, the Puritans viewed elaborate meals as evidence of moral decay. Even within the Catholic Church, reformers sought to rein in episcopal banquets, insisting that bishops feed the poor, not indulge in elaborate courses. The French wars of religion, the 30 Years' War, and local uprisings all revealed the growing resentment beneath the silver trays and marzipan sculptures. Food riots became more common, especially in cities. And then came the 17th century, a time when famine, inflation, and royal pageantry collided. Louis XIV of France perfected the idea of the table as theater. At Versailles, every meal was part of a larger performance. Courtiers observed him eating. Servants passed food with choreographed grace. The king's appetite became part of his image, measured, noble, unflustered. But outside the palace gates, France suffered periodic crop failures. In the 1690s, a severe famine killed nearly 2 million people across northern France. The nobility still feasted. The peasants did not. And so the divide at the table, once taken for granted, became a source of instability. By the 18th century, this inequality would boil over. Food was no longer just sustenance or symbolism, it was a spark. The French Revolution, in part, was ignited by grain shortages, bread riots, and the infamous and possibly apocryphal phrase, "Let them eat cake." That line, regardless of who said it, captured the enduring disconnect between those who feasted and those who starved. Noble meals, once seen as a divine right, were now viewed as proof of corruption. By the time the guillotines came out, many feast halls had been repurposed, some as public meeting houses, others as prisons. Gilded platters were melted. The recipes of the elite were lost, or rewritten by revolutionary cooks using local beans and boiled roots. The spectacle collapsed. And yet echoes remain. Every time we plate food to impress, we recall noble banquets. Every wedding buffet, every Thanksgiving table, every Michelin star tasting menu carries traces of the medieval performance of feasting. But so too does the hunger. Food inequality persists. Scarcity still walks beside excess. The tension between plenty and poverty still defines much of the modern world. The medieval noble table didn't just disappear. It evolved, and in some places it endures. The difference now is that we can see it more clearly. We know the history behind the platter, and we can ask the question that medieval peasants only whispered. Who gets to feast? Who gets to fast? And why do we still live at the same table, divided? The image is vivid. A medieval kitchen, smoke hanging in the rafters, haunches of meat swinging from beams, swarmed by flies. In the corner, a grizzled cook hacks greenish fat from a questionable leg of mutton, slathers it in spices, and serves it without hesitation. It's an idea burned into the popular imagination, that medieval people ate rotten meat, disguised the stench with cloves and cinnamon, and simply had stronger stomachs. But is it true? Let's start with a quieter, more accurate picture, not one of recklessness but of desperation, of cleverness, and of cold calculation. Because food preservation in the Middle Ages wasn't about flavor, it was about survival. Fresh meat was a luxury, preserved meat was a necessity. And the line between aged and spoiled wasn't always obvious. The average medieval household didn't have a refrigerator. They didn't have vacuum-sealed packaging, plastic wrap, or factory sterilization. They had seasons, cellars, and fire, and they had to make those tools work. Meat spoiled fast, in summer within a day, in winter maybe 3, so preservation wasn't a technique, it was a requirement. Let's break down how they did it. Salt was the most common and reliable method. Not the salt on your dinner table, but coarse, crystalline, and expensive. Meat was packed in layers of salt, pressed into barrels, and stored in cool, dark places. The salt pulled moisture from the meat, which inhibited bacterial growth. After a few weeks, the meat would be firm, dry, and pungent. Salted pork, beef, and herring were staples. Soldiers marched on salt meat. Sailors lived on it. Monasteries recorded precise rations, so many pounds of salted fish per monk per week. But salt had limits. It was expensive. In some regions it was taxed. Poorer households couldn't afford to preserve large amounts. And the result wasn't pleasant. It was chewy, salty, and required soaking before cooking. Still, salted meat kept through winter, which made it essential. In smoky kitchens across Europe, meat and fish were hung above the hearth or in separate smokehouses. The slow exposure to smoke, especially hardwood smoke, dried the outer layers and added natural preservatives like formaldehyde and phenols. Smoked sausage, smoked eel, smoked bacon, these were common. The process varied by region. In Germany and Scandinavia, cold smoking was popular. In southern Europe, hotter smoke was used, often combined with sun drying. Again, the result was not rot, it was toughness. Smoked meat could last for weeks or months. The taste, strong, the texture, stringy, but it was edible and that was enough. In drier climates, meat could be sun-dried, cut into strips and hung. This worked best for fish or thin cuts of beef. In rainy areas, drying was harder, though indoor drying near fires was possible. Jerky-style meat wasn't widespread but was known. More common was the drying of grains, legumes, and fruit. Apples, plums, and grapes dried into raisins, stored for baking or winter stews. Vinegar was used to preserve some meats and especially vegetables. Brining, a mixture of water, salt, and sometimes spices, could also keep meat edible for a few weeks. This was mostly a method of the wealthy or the urban. Vinegar was not always available in rural homes, and it was more commonly used in monasteries and city kitchens. In areas of France and Spain, duck and pork were cooked and stored in their own fat. The meat was submerged, sealing it from air. This method, known now as confit, was surprisingly effective. As long as it was kept cool and sealed, the meat could last weeks. Similar practices occurred in England and Germany, often using lard or suet to seal jars. Here, where the line blurs. Some preservation methods today considered off were, in the medieval world, acceptable. Fermented fish sauces, like garum in the Roman era, lingered into medieval times in some Mediterranean regions. In Scandinavia, fermented herring, surströmming, remains a traditional food to this day. Rancid fat was sometimes tolerated, especially when food was scarce. It was cut away, covered in spices, or cooked heavily. Did people eat spoiled meat? Sometimes, but not carelessly. Cookbooks and health manuals frequently warned against corrupt flesh. There was an understanding of spoilage, even without germ theory. Smell, color, and texture were observed. Sick animals were avoided. Food poisoning existed and people feared it. So the myth of the iron stomach is false. People didn't eat rotting meat on purpose, but they did eat heavily preserved meat, which, by modern standards, may have seemed unpleasant. And when food did turn, it wasn't thrown away, it was repurposed. Spoiled broth might be boiled again with vinegar. Tough meat might be stewed with strong herbs like sage or hyssop. Meat near spoiling might be turned into pies, sealed under dough and baked to kill bacteria. This brings us to the spice myth, the idea that spices were used to hide the taste of rot. It's appealing but inaccurate. Spices were too expensive to waste on bad food. Pepper, cloves, and saffron were used sparingly, mostly by the wealthy, and in meals where they could be tasted, not hidden. Instead, spices were used for flavor, prestige, and sometimes health. Medical theory held that spices balanced the humors, aided digestion, and protected against illness. Ginger was warming, cinnamon was calming, cloves were cleansing. So while spoiled meat may have been consumed in desperation, it was not disguised with spices. It was soaked, boiled, and eaten reluctantly. For most households, the real key to preservation was not a clever technique, but planning. Slaughtering animals in autumn, when temperatures fell. Curing meats before Lent to survive the fast. Storing grain in elevated granaries to keep it dry and rodent-free. Root cellars for carrots, turnips, onions. Communal ovens that baked multiple loaves once a week. It was this rhythm, slow, seasonal, predictable, that kept people alive. Not spices, not miracles, just routine. And even then the system failed. Poor harvests meant no meat to preserve. Mold ruined stored grain. Salt shipments were delayed. Rats invaded the cellar. Famine often followed not from lack of knowledge, but from bad luck. So did they eat rotten meat? Sometimes, but rarely by choice. More often they ate salted, dried, or smoked meat, bland porridges and stale bread, preserved beans and legumes, thin stews stretched for days, pickled vegetables and hard cheese. Food was not about pleasure, it was about survival. They didn't have stronger stomachs, they had lower expectations and fewer options. But they also had resilience, centuries of accumulated knowledge passed down from cook to apprentice, from mother to daughter, from monk to servant. They didn't conquer rot, they endured it. But what happens when preservation fails entirely? When rot wins? When disease spreads not just through food, but through entire communities? In the next story, we'll meet the man with the knife, the apron, and the blood-stained hands, the reluctant butcher, an uncelebrated but essential figure in the village economy of fear and flesh. In the corner of every medieval village, usually near a stream or just beyond the edge of town, stood a modest, often ignored building. It smelled of iron, wet straw, and old blood. Flies hovered. Dogs waited. This was the butcher's stall. Not a shop, not a place of prestige, but a workplace marked by necessity and suspicion. And inside it stood the butcher. Not a craftsman in the romantic sense. Not a chef, but something between a laborer and a priest, tasked with turning life into meat, breath into food, and doing so without contaminating the village's water, morals, or souls. Because in medieval society, the butcher was both essential and marginal, someone who performed the work everyone relied on, but few wanted to watch. Let's begin with the basics. The butcher's job was more than just cutting meat. It was procurement, slaughter, preparation, and sale. A village butcher might source animals from local farmers, inspect them for disease as best he could, slaughter them, usually by throat cutting, not blunt force, drain and skin the carcasses, clean and prepare organs, cut the meat into sellable portions, cure, salt, or smoke meat if possible, sell leftovers as scraps, offal, or suet. All without refrigeration, all within hours. In larger towns, the butcher was licensed, regulated by the guild or by the town council. He might have a stall in the market square or near the shambles, a designated meat market. In small villages, it was informal. A butcher might work from a shed behind his home, or even in the open air, near a water source for cleaning. But this wasn't a glorified profession. The work was dirty, bloody, and morally ambiguous. Unlike today, where meat is largely dissociated from the process of death, medieval people knew where their meat came from. They heard the cries. They smelled the blood. And butchers were the ones who caused it. Some feared that killing so often hardened the soul. In religious terms, frequent slaughter was seen as spiritually dangerous. Some preachers warned that butchers might grow indifferent to suffering, not only that of animals but of humans. This perception pushed butchers to the edge of the social hierarchy. They were needed, they were paid, but they were not always respected. In fact, in some places, butchers were buried in separate plots or denied certain religious privileges. They were sometimes forbidden from jury service or excluded from town councils. Butchers were also considered ritually impure by some religious authorities, especially when laws of fasting or abstinence were involved. During Lent or on Fridays, selling meat could be seen as a violation of Christian or civic codes. Still, the butcher's work didn't stop. It simply moved into shadier corners or operated behind closed stalls. Slaughter wasn't daily. Most animals were killed at specific times of year, late autumn primarily, before winter made feed scarce and freezing temperatures aided preservation. This was known as Martinmas slaughter, around November 11, when communities would butcher pigs and cattle en masse. Families salted what they could, cooked what wouldn't keep, and rendered fat for candles and cooking. The butcher worked tirelessly during these times, often dawn to dusk, knife in hand, up to his elbows in steaming offal. His tools were few but effective. A long curved knife for cutting throats and skinning. A cleaver for separating joints and splitting bones. Hooks, buckets, and in wealthier stalls, blocks and pulleys for hoisting carcasses. He had no protective clothing, an apron perhaps made from leather, hands calloused, arms stained. And mistakes were costly. Cut the wrong tendon and you ruined the leg. Fail to pierce the right artery and the animal might suffer longer or fight back. Get caught with spoiled meat and you could be fined, banned, or worse. Not all meat was equal. The best cuts, tenderloin, liver, shanks, went to the nobility, clergy, or merchants. The butcher might sell these directly or through contracts. The rest, gristle, neck, feet, blood, was sold to the poor. Offal, including intestines, lungs, and kidneys, was widely consumed. In fact, many traditional medieval dishes are based on these parts: blood sausages, tripe stews, boiled tongue. Nothing was wasted. Even the bladder might be inflated and dried for use as a container or a child's toy. Bones were boiled for soup. Fat was rendered for candles or soap. Hides were sold to tanners. The very hooves and horns were repurposed for tools and combs. A good butcher wasn't just a killer. He was an economist of anatomy, squeezing every last coin from every last ounce. But the lines between ethical work, illegal practices, and outright exploitation could be very thin. During times of famine or religious fasting, butchers sometimes sold meat in secret. This was risky. Penalties for selling meat during Lent were harsh. In some towns, violators were publicly shamed or banned from trading. Some were excommunicated. Still, the demand was constant. In desperate times, meat from dead animals, those that died of illness, old age, or accident, was sometimes sold illegally. This was dangerous. Without modern veterinary knowledge, it was nearly impossible to distinguish between harmless and diseased flesh. Rumors of poisoned meat or tainted blood circulated widely. If people got sick, the butcher was often blamed, even when the cause was weather or water. To protect themselves, some butchers kept ledgers of where their animals came from and when they were slaughtered. Others offered meat only to trusted clients. But in general, the butcher lived one mistake away from ruin. Despite their essential role, butchers remained socially distinct. In urban guilds, they were often in their own category, below goldsmiths and weavers, closer in rank to tanners or executioners. Their children could rise, but the profession itself was considered rough. Still, in some cities, the most successful butchers became wealthy. They purchased shops, employed apprentices, and diversified into soap making, leatherwork, or tallow trading. In a few exceptional cases, a butcher became a councilman or benefactor, but these were rare. The blood was hard to wash away, literally and symbolically. The medieval butcher lived between sacrifice and survival, utility and stigma. He fed his neighbors, clothed their feet via leather, and lit their homes via fat. But he was still kept at a distance. He was not quite a villain, not quite a hero. A man whose daily labor turned living creatures into nourishment, whose hands bore the weight of hunger, class, and death. A man who worked where others looked away. But what happened when the butcher himself disappeared? When towns grew large, meat came from elsewhere and slaughter moved out of sight. In the next section, we'll follow the transformation of meat from local to commercial, from personal to impersonal, and see how the village butcher became a relic of a vanishing world. In the early days of medieval Europe, the butcher was always near, close to the hearth of the village, close to the market square, and close to the people he fed. His cleaver struck just a few steps from the customer's home. The animal you ate was the animal you had seen alive. But by the end of the Middle Ages, something had begun to shift. Towns were growing. Villages were becoming market hubs. Cities like Paris, London, and Bruges had tens of thousands of mouths to feed. And with that growth came the slow disappearance of the local butcher as a familiar figure, replaced by systems, guilds, and distance. Let's walk through that transformation, from stall to system. In small villages, butchering was a personal affair. In cities, it became a civic concern. With denser populations came new problems: stench, disease, and waste. Blood flowed through gutters. Piles of bones attracted dogs and rats. The air buzzed with flies. The local authorities took notice, not to protect the butchers but to protect the public. In 13th century London, butchers were ordered to move their operations outside the city walls to a district called the Shambles. The same happened in York, Bruges, and Paris. Butchers were corralled into designated areas, and their activities tightly monitored. Why? Because butchering was not only unpleasant, it was dangerous. Rotting flesh and entrails dumped into rivers fouled drinking water. Blood pools created mosquito breeding grounds. Disease spread easily in the summer months. City councils imposed ordinances. Slaughter only at approved times. Waste must be carted away, not always obeyed. Meat must be inspected before sale. Diseased animals must be destroyed, not sold. Prices set by the guild or council. Thus, the butcher's independence began to erode. He became a regulated agent in a larger food economy. Still needed, still paid, but no longer autonomous. As cities grew, butcher guilds emerged. These weren't simply labor unions. They were economic gatekeepers, controlling who could sell meat, what prices could be charged, and who could be trained. They created apprenticeship systems, lobbied for political power, and maintained religious patronage, often to saints associated with animals or protection. In Paris, the Confrérie des Bouchers became a powerful body, complete with its own chapel, banners, and feast days. Guilds offered protection, but also enforced conformity. A butcher could no longer innovate or undercut his rivals. He followed the rules or was expelled. An entrance into a guild required years of apprenticeship, fees, and often family connections. The freelance village butcher became increasingly rare. Meanwhile, towns became hubs for meat importation. Rural areas supplied live animals to city markets, where they were slaughtered on-site by licensed butchers. Urban populations had no connection to the raising of animals, just the finished product. This began the distancing of death from consumption. As the 15th century progressed, meat handling became bureaucratic. Markets had inspectors. Records were kept of what animals arrived, who slaughtered them, and what cuts were sold. Standard weights and measures were introduced. Fines were levied for bad practices. This was not out of concern for the animal, but concern for the economy and public order. City governments feared meat shortages, bread riots fueled by hunger, scandals over spoiled or unchristian meat. tax losses from unregistered sales. So they built infrastructure, centralized shambles, designated waste pits, and meat halls with stone slabs and drainage channels. The act of butchery became a municipal affair. And with it, the butcher became less a craftsman and more a functionary. In this new system, class determined what kind of meat you bought and from where. The rich sent servants to the butcher's stall or arranged direct delivery. The middle class bargained at market, often buying cuts or small game. The poor waited until the end of the day, buying bones, organs, and offal. Some even purchased animal heads, feet, or stomachs. These were boiled into stews, scraped for marrow, or pickled for winter. Nothing was wasted. But as cities grew, the poor increasingly ate less meat overall, relying on bread, beans, and vegetables. Meat became a class marker, a sign of economic privilege. Meanwhile, consumers became removed from the process of slaughter. Children no longer saw animals being killed. Housewives bought cuts already trimmed. The act of killing, once communal and visible, was now partitioned behind walls. The butcher remained, but as a background figure. No longer feared, no longer shunned, just overlooked. In times of crisis, war, famine, plague, butchers were called upon by the state, not only to keep feeding people, but to control the narrative of order. During sieges, butchers were ordered to stretch rations and issue limited portions. During Lent, they were monitored to ensure no meat was sold. During plague outbreaks, they were instructed to burn contaminated carcasses. They were also requisitioned by armies. Campaigns required meat. Mobile butcher crews followed troops, slaughtering livestock as needed. It was messy, brutal work, often with little pay or protection. The butcher had become an instrument of bureaucracy, his cleaver now wielded in service of systems, not communities. Back in the countryside, the traditional village butcher began to disappear. Farmers began to slaughter their own animals or send them to towns. Surplus meat was sold to traders who brought it back, already salted, smoked, or dried. Without a market large enough to support a professional, the village butcher became a relic. His tools were passed down or sold, his role absorbed into a larger network of trade. Some butchers survived by adapting, offering tanning services, or becoming game wardens for local lords. Others joined mobile markets, traveling from village to village with meat in wagons. But the central role of the butcher in village life, provider, killer, transformer, was fading. In his place rose the anonymous systems of supply, bureaucrats, traders, shippers, and guild clerks. The cleaver remained, but the hand that held it was no longer known. With the decline of the village butcher came a loss of transparency. People no longer knew where their meat came from. Skill, fewer learned the craft of efficient slaughter and full use. Communal rhythm, the seasonal killing days gave way to constant, impersonal trade. Responsibility, consumption became passive, not participatory. Meat was still eaten, but the story behind it had changed. And this shift set the stage for industrial slaughter, centuries later. But long before the factory or the feedlot, the groundwork was laid in these forgotten corners of medieval towns. So what happened next? How did this disconnection between food and life, between death and dinner, shape the rest of society? In the final section, we'll follow the butcher's legacy into early modern Europe, where religion, regulation, and the ethics of eating began to collide, laying the foundation for modern debates we still live with today. The butcher had stepped into the shadows. As towns swelled and markets mechanized, his presence became quieter, his work more regulated, more distant. And yet, his legacy persisted, not just in food, but in law, belief, and morality. Because long after the butcher left the village square, the questions his work raised, about suffering, ethics, food, and death, kept surfacing. And by the early modern period, those questions became impossible to ignore. In late medieval and early modern Europe, the Christian calendar still shaped the butcher's life. Lent, Advent, Ember Days, and weekly fasts all limited when meat could be sold. Fridays were meatless. Entire months meatless. For butchers, this meant boom and bust cycles. On the day before Lent, sales soared. For 40 days afterward, they dropped, unless rules were ignored. Some butchers defied the law and sold in secret. Others tried to diversify, offering fish, eggs, or even fake meats made from spiced bread and almonds. But more interesting was the emerging moral concern. Religious reformers, especially after the Protestant Reformation, began to scrutinize not just what people ate, but how they ate. Gluttony, indulgence, and cruelty became topics of moral sermons. Did killing desensitize the soul? Could a good Christian be a butcher? These weren't idle questions. Martin Luther, though less rigid than Catholic authorities, still emphasized modesty in food. Calvinists in the Netherlands and Geneva pushed for plain diets, simple cooking, and moral restraint. Butchers became a test case for how religion treated uncomfortable professions, useful but unclean. In some cities, butchers were placed under stricter codes than other tradesmen. They had to swear oaths of ethical slaughter. In others, they were barred from holding religious office. And yet, society could not do without them. So butchers remained, tolerated, watched, and slightly feared. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the regulation of meat had become forensic. Cities employed inspectors not only to monitor quality, but to investigate animal deaths. There was a rising awareness of foodborne illness, even without modern germ theory. Slaughter was no longer just a chore, it was a public health issue. Officials recorded animal origin, time of slaughter, weather conditions, method of disposal for waste. In Venice, inspectors wore badges and were empowered to confiscate meat deemed unfit. In London, the sale of black meat, spoiled meat, became a finable offense. Butchers who broke the rules risked not only their livelihood, but imprisonment. This marked a turning point. The butcher, once an artisan, was now a regulated risk factor. His hands had always held a knife, but now they also held liability. As butchers were pushed out of central spaces, they reappeared in an unlikely place: popular literature and satire. In ballads, mystery plays, and even early novels, the butcher became a symbol of brutality, the Butcher King trope, for cruel rulers; gluttony, linked to overconsumption and moral failure; ignorance, depicted as uneducated, rude, or coarse; rough justice, sometimes portrayed as enforcers or folk heroes. Even Shakespeare used the term bloody butcher in Macbeth, linking slaughter to moral decay. And yet, real butchers were far from villainous. They were often family men, small business owners, tax-paying citizens. Their portrayal reflected not who they were, but how society projected its discomfort with meat and mortality. Because by this time, most people no longer saw slaughter, they saw only meat. And the butcher became a stand-in for the uncomfortable truth: someone must kill for us to eat. As Europe industrialized, cities grew beyond what small butchery stalls could support. With urban populations exploding, a new solution emerged: the centralized slaughterhouse. In Paris 1810, London 1855, and Berlin, governments established state-run abattoirs. These facilities moved slaughter fully out of view. They were designed for sanitation, efficiency, control. This marked the true end of the medieval butcher. His work, once personal, intimate, and messy, became institutional, then industrial. Where one man once processed 2 pigs a day, a factory might process 200. The cleaver was now a machine. The stall was a warehouse. And the connection between death and dinner all but vanished. But the moral questions remained. As the butcher faded from view, he left behind a series of unresolved legacies. The ethics of killing animals for food, the social discomfort with those who kill on our behalf, the cultural weight of meat as status, sin, and necessity, the way society delegates violence to the margins. In many ways, the medieval butcher anticipated modern dilemmas. He performed labor others refused to do. He was essential, yet excluded. He was regulated but rarely appreciated. And perhaps most importantly, he knew what meat really was. Today we eat meat wrapped in plastic, processed far from home, and sterilized of all context. We do not see the animal. We do not smell the blood. We do not hear the final breath. But the butcher did. And so perhaps he had the clearest conscience of all. He did not pretend. He did not forget. He simply worked one carcass at a time.